go from 1 to 2 when the first one's done.
Hi, my name is Henry Smith. Welcome to another episode of Digging for Truth. Today I'm joined in the studio with my friend, colleague, and professional archaeologist, Dr. Bryant Wood. Hi, Bryant. How are you?
Good. Good to be here, Henry.
It's good to see you here in the studio.
Yes.
We're very excited to have you.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, we've got a great topic to talk about today. And it has to do with, we're going to jump right into it. I say this every episode, we're going to jump right into it because we have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the excavations that ABR has done at Khirbet el-Maqader, which we've identified as the Eye of Joshua. And of course, you're the one who led up this research over 20 years ago. So let's talk for the audience a little bit first, to sort of lay a foundation about the city of Ai in Joshua 7 and 8. Could you share with the audience what the skeptics have said for decades about Ai and its relationship to the Bible?
Well, the location of Ai has been a controversial issue in biblical archaeology, and there is a place that scholars identified as Ai. It's called Et Tel,
right.
About 10 miles north of Jerusalem. And they say, well, we believe this is the place that's written about in Joshua 7 and 8. However, it does not match the biblical description in that there was no occupation at the time of Joshua.
Right.
Now you'd think, wow, isn't this a major problem in this identification? But that, for the liberal critic scholar, that doesn't matter. They just say, well, obviously the biblical story was made up, based on the ruins at Tel.
Right.
And the person who really kind of set it in stone, this identification, was W.F. Albright, who's considered the father of biblical archaeology, in an article he wrote back in the 1920s where he looked at possible places for Ai, and he decided that the only possible candidate was this Et Tel because there were ruins there from an early time period, and he said there's no other candidate in the area.
So this must be it.
This must be it. In other words, it was an identification by default because they didn't have a better candidate.
And Albright was what we call the father of biblical archaeology, right? He had a moderate respect for the Bible, I would say.
He did.
And so people looked to him with respect and said, oh, well, it's Albright saying it, so it must be correct.
Sure.
So we're just going to bring a couple typical quotes up on the screen here, and I'll read them, and these speak for themselves. But here's one from Joseph Calloway. Now, he was involved, right, in the excavations at Tel.
Yes, he was.
Right. He says, check this out, archaeology has wiped out the historical credibility of the conquest of Ai as reported in Joshua 7 and 8. Right? This is very typical of what you find in the literature.
Oh, yes.
And then we have another one here from Zioni Zevet. Am I saying that right? Zioni? Is that
Zevet, I think that's correct.
All right. And sure, the evidence shows that there was no city at Ai for the Israelites to conquer. So we're just bringing those quotes up just to show people, like, this is what we find in the academic literature.
It's all through the literature.
Right. So when Albright established this idea that Ai was at Et Tel, then later Et Tel was excavated, and this is the conclusion that was drawn. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So now you started looking more closely at this back in, was it the 1980s, 1990s?
Late 80s, early 90s. Right.
So, and you started looking at the geography and the text and alternatives. So let's talk about how that happened and what your thought process was at that time.
Well, of course, ABR has been involved in this search from the beginning. That's why ABR was founded, was to do field work, to locate Ai, because, of course, our founder, David Livingston, realized this is a major problem, a major issue.
The eye problem.
The eye problem, yes. So he began his research at a site called Kerbert Nisia, and he thought this had possibilities, and I participated in that dig for quite a few seasons, but the evidence just was not forthcoming. So I began thinking maybe it's at another site nearby or something.
Right.
And I got a hold of a survey that the Israelis had done in this area. In fact, I spent one day working with Israel Finkelstein out on the West Bank during the time he was surveying sites out there. And I just was flipping through that report, and I came to a plate of pottery that looked to me to be pottery from the time of Joshua. And so that's what drove my interest to this particular site called Kerbert El Makader. And it's only a few miles from Nisia, so it's in the right
It's in the right area.
Right area.
Yeah.
And so I began doing kind of little field trips. Whenever I was in Israel, I'd go there and pick up pottery and look around and check the geography. And pretty soon I was quite convinced that this is a viable candidate just because of the geography. And we'll probably get into that a little bit.
Yes.
But it fit the geography perfectly. And so I thought, wow, we need to excavate this site.
We need to take a look further at
Yes.
it, right? And this is part of research. You know, it's not only just digging in the ground, but digging through the literature and the reading. And it's so there's two big facets to this kind of research. So we're going to bring up a map on the screen here just to show people where it's located. And you can see in the map how close it is to Etel and Kerbet El Makader are less than a mile from each
Yeah,
other.
1 kilometer.
So in one sense, you can understand how a scholar might look at the region and say, oh, well, maybe that's I, meaning Etel, right?
Yes.
Now, we're also going to take another view here as we're looking at this. Our next one is an overhead view of the area. And let's talk about this just a little bit. Because I think this will help the audience sort of understand the region a little bit better. So if you could just talk about some of the cities that we see on there.
Yes, well, this is taken with in the foreground. I believe that's Deir de Boine. I can't read the writing, but we have over on the left our site, Kerbet El Makader, and over on the right is a site that's been identified as Bethel, and that's Beitin. Do I have that right, Henry?
You do.
You can see it better.
You're
than I
doing
can.
great.
Yeah.
So we have those sites, and the Bible, we're going to talk in our next segment, identifies these sites as being close to Ai. So,
Yes.
but the picture gives the audience an idea of part of what our research is involved in. It's not just digging in the ground.
Right.
But it's looking at all of the variables involved in studying the Bible. So now let's talk a little bit. We have about a minute left in this segment. So we're going to show an overhead Google Earth view of Makader. Could you describe a little bit about like where it's located and how fun it was to walk there when we would go dig there a little bit, just to give people an idea?
Well, when I first went out there, that road that you see wasn't there. That was put in later. But you can see the hill that it's located on, and we had to take a bus every day from Jerusalem to get out there because it's on the West Bank, and get off the bus and then climb up the hill carrying all of our stuff. So logistically, it was a challenge. But we were able to do that and have 14 seasons, I believe, altogether, at least 14 years of working there with a little break during the Intifada. But
Yes.
the Lord just provided, and we were able to do our work there.
Well, he certainly did. Friends, please don't go away. We're going to continue on in our next segment, sharing with you all the exciting evidence that we've discovered at Kerbet El Makader, which we believe is the eye of Joshua 7 and 8. And we'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm joined today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Bryant Wood, in the studio, who's a professional archaeologist and who led excavations at our site of Kerbet El Makader, which we believe is the eye of Joshua 7 and 8. Bryant, We were talking in the last segment, just trying to lay a foundation for people to try to understand what it is we're talking about. You know, you and I, we live in this world. It's almost old hat to us in terms of where the place is and what we do there and the work that we've done. So let's help walk the audience through some of the things that you observed in the scriptures, because what's interesting is the narrative of Joshua 7:8 is rich with detail. And so there's a lot you can look for to correlate it with the Bible. So we're going to bring up in our picture here the strategic location of Ai. Mm-hmm. So Joshua sends the men up to the city to scout it out. Talk about that in Joshua 7:2. Mm-hmm. He sends them from Jericho up to Ai.
Mm-hmm. Well, as an archaeologist, when I read these passages, certain things jump out.
Yes.
You know, as we know, Ai was the second place the Israelites attacked when they came into the Promised Land, the first one being Jericho. And Jericho's down in the Jordan Valley. Ai, however, is up in the hill country. So now, Joshua is a smart fellow, a good general and leader. So he must have had a reason for picking this particular place as the first site he would attack in the central hill country. And here in Joshua 7:2, that scripture verse that was there, he is giving instructions to the spies of where this place is. And so he's saying it's east of Bethel, it's near Beth Aven. And so right away, for an archaeologist, you say, okay, if I want to know where Ai is, I better know where Bethel is, and I better know where Beth Aven is. And as a matter of fact, all three of these sites have been controversial as to where they're located. But that's part of the puzzle. To know where Ai is, we really have to identify Bethel, and we have to identify Beth Aven. Now, those are separate shows. Right. We're not going to talk about that in this show. Right. But that's number one.
But it's related. They're related.
Yes, they're related. Yeah. And we should expect that Ai would be located in a strategic place, because otherwise, why bother with it?
Yes.
And we'll probably talk about that. It is strategic.
Very strategic. And we saw in the picture, if we could bring that back up, that picture up there is looking south towards Jerusalem, mm-hmm. and you can see the towers in the background. That's on the north side of the Mount of Olives, isn't it?
Right.
So the military commander at that site has line of sight to Jerusalem.
Absolutely. Now that's 9 miles, but this is a nice clear day, so you can clearly see that yes, they could signal to Jerusalem. Well, if there was some invader coming from the north, then the fortress there at Ai could send a signal. So in the overall strategy and the layout of the sites, we would expect that this would be kind of a fortress outpost. It's kind of a border outpost. And we find that it's located right on a wadi that's a dividing line between the territory of Jerusalem to the south and the territory of Shechem to the north.
And when we say wadi, we mean a riverbed.
Dry riverbed.
Yes. That runs through there,
yes,
right?
So it's very strategic.
Very important. Okay, so we're going to bring up another picture. One of the criteria that you identified was, as you mentioned, that the site has to be east of Bethel and near Beth Aven. So we're going to show that again. This is the picture we showed before, and we can see that in the screen. So as you were investigating this, you were looking at this matrix of evidence.
Yes, absolutely.
To make sure that the site has to fit this criteria.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Of course, we believe the Bible's the Word of God. It's accurate. So the site has to fit what the text says.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
That's the way we do it. Okay, so now another criteria that you identified was you had to find an adequate ambush site, mm-hmm. because the text indicates that. Talk a little bit about the ambush site and what Joshua did with his forces.
Yes. The geography described is very unique, because it talks about an ambush site on the east side of Ai. And so that should be a deep valley where you could hide a large force of men.
Right. So they couldn't see it from Ai.
Right.
Yes.
And so they could hide there until the right time when Joshua gives the signal. Then they could come out of hiding and attack the men of Ai or the city of Ai or whatever. Then, on the other hand, we find that we have another valley mentioned. It's on the north side of Ai, and it should be shallow. And that's the valley where Joshua took a small force when they first arrived in chapter 8 at the site with the whole Israelite army. Joshua took a small force and camped overnight in the valley just on the north side of Ai. Well, we read how the commander of the fortress came out and was able to see Joshua and the Israelites, so it was a shallow valley.
Right.
They weren't hidden from sight.
So the text doesn't say it's a shallow valley,
No.
but you're inferring that from the narrative.
It has to be.
So in it, the king comes out in the morning and he sees Joshua's army. Now, what Joshua has done here, this strategy is from the Lord, right? God has given him this strategy. He's baiting the king, isn't he?
Absolutely.
Right? He wants him to come out because the ambush force is on the other side. So we could bring up here also on the screen this picture of the shallow valley looking north. We can see two things. One is we can see how shallow it is, and the second thing we can see is on the very top of the screen there, we can see that ridge. Talk about that ridge up there and why that would be significant for the battle of Ai.
Another thing we read in Scripture is when Joshua brought his army up there, he put the main force on a hill north of Ai. And so, again, that must be a very important hill. And this hill, north of our site, is the highest hill in the whole area. So from that vantage point, his generals could look down and see the entire battlefield. And so that was a very strategic location for the army, and it fits, again, the landscape that we have. So these are unique features. How many sites are going to have these features with a deep valley on one side, a shallow valley on the north side, a very high hill beyond that for the army?
For the right.
Yeah, right. So it just fits perfectly. You don't even have to put a shovel in the ground to see that, but you need to get the archaeological evidence if you want to prove, hey, this was the place of Ai.
Yeah, and this is part of the work that we've done at ABR is we look at the biblical text very carefully. And then when we have these indicators, geography is a great tool that we can use to show the Bible's accuracy, isn't it?
Yes.
Especially in the Ai account.
Mm-hmm. Yes. In Joshua 7 and 8, we have a listing of quite a number, 6 or 7 geographical features that are mentioned, and then we have archaeological features. So when I read through there and I read about a gate, it must be fortified.
Well, we're going to talk about the gate in the next segment. So folks, don't go away. We're going to talk about the gate and other discoveries from the city of Ai. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm joined today by archaeologist Dr. Bryant Wood, Director of Research with the Associates for Biblical Research. Today we've been talking about in our first 2 segments the city of Ai in Joshua 7 and 8. And so far we've laid the foundation for folks to understand the research that we've done there. First, the biblical text and some of what it says and some of the geography. So now let's turn, we're going to give a taste of some of the archaeological discoveries here, and then we're going to have another episode where we have a whole episode to talk about more of the archaeology, which is your area of expertise. We'll talk about that more. So let's talk about a little bit some of the requirements. The first is the city gate. Let's talk about that a little bit, if you would, please.
Well, as we mentioned in the last segment, we have both geographical features in these chapters, but we also have archaeological features. I mentioned when an archaeologist reads through the Scripture, he sees things that maybe the average reader would not.
Right.
But we do have archaeological requirements. And so we read in chapter 7 and chapter 8 about a gate. Well, this tells us this place was fortified. And so we should expect to find not only a gate, but fortification walls around the site. And in our very first visit, or season, I should say, at the site where we were doing some exploration, we found a gate socket stone. It was visible on the surface. And so this really kind of got us started
Yes.
into the fortification system, because we were able to right away excavate the gate that's mentioned in
In the
Joshua
biblical
7.
account.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very explicit mention. I mean, this is kind of a sad moment here, and it's because the Israelites, they kill the king,
Yeah.
the king of Ai, and they bury him in the city gate.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is an important detail that's found in the text. So we're going to talk about our discovery of the gate. Now we have to tell the audience we didn't find the king of Ai.
No.
But we did find the city gate, and we're going to talk about that right now. So let's take a look at this view north, which we actually showed before, but in the foreground you can see the gate. Tell the story a little bit about how that was discovered and how excited you guys were when that happened.
Yeah, in 1995 we found the gate socket stone, and in subsequent seasons then we excavated the area, and you can see kind of a horseshoe shape there in the photo. That's one chamber of this gate. And we could see the tops of those stones right on the surface. That's the beauty of a Kerbert. You know, it's just a kind of a level ruin, not a tell with many layers.
Right, like Tel Aviv, Tel Hatzor, places like that.
Tel
that
Megiddo.
Right.
So, I mean, we're talking about an event that took place in 1406 BC, 3,400 years ago. And to think that you could see a structure from that time at the surface is quite amazing. But
Yeah.
that's the way it is in archaeology.
You never know what you're going to find,
when
right?
you're dealing with a Kerbert, because you
Right.
don't have layers of occupation over covering it.
So let's show that. We're going to show the drawing. I'm sorry, I didn't
Go ahead.
interrupt you. We're going to show the drawing of the gate, and then just see. There's the big picture of it, and then in our next picture, we're going to show a close up of that west chamber. So talk
Yes.
about that. That's the key evidence, right
Yes,
there.
we see the socket stones there just below at the bottom of that picture, and we found one initially, the large one there on the right was the one that we saw popping up out of the surface. But as we excavated, we found a second one to the left, a little bit smaller, but nevertheless too large to be connected with just a simple house. This is from a large structure, and we are familiar with these kinds of socket stones from other digs. So we know it's from a city gate. And so from there, then we excavated that kind of a U-shaped outline there.
Yes.
And we had one chamber. Now, unfortunately, the other chambers were not there. We have a lot of robbing of stones from the earlier period of the fortress of Ai for buildings that were constructed later in the Iron Age, in late Hellenistic, early Roman, even up into the Byzantine period.
Yes.
They were robbing out stones for their construction. So it was a quarry for them.
So they didn't care about us doing archaeology
no.
in the 21st century. They were concerned about building a house, and they didn't care it was from the
Yeah.
time of Joshua, right, or building fortification.
Fortunately, they used this one chamber for other purposes
Yeah.
later on, and so it survived.
Yeah. So in the providence of God, we're very fortunate
Absolutely.
that it was there, because it should have,
absolutely.
in theory, been robbed out.
Oh,
huh?
yes.
Yeah. So that was awesome. So we saw those socket stones. Now, if I remember correctly, we took those off the site. It took like 3 or 4 guys to load those into a
they're
truck,
heavy.
right?
Yes,
they were
absolutely.
gigantic.
Yes, very heavy.
Which indicates it was not for a domestic structure.
No.
So a large fortification. Now, in our next picture here, we're gonna talk about the fortifications, because this is actually very important, not just for the description in Joshua, but the bigger picture of this period. The biblical account indicates in Deuteronomy and in Numbers that when the spies went in the land, they said the cities are great and walled up to heaven.
Yes.
Giant fortification structure. Now here's structures. Here's what we think the city looked like.
Yes, there's our gate on the right.
Yep, and how we thought the walls were. And then we're going to show just one picture of some of the remnants here of Dr. Oral Collins standing on top of those. And in that, tell folks how big and wide these walls were and how tall we think they were.
We have just remnants remaining of the fortress, bits and pieces here and there.
Right.
because of this robbing out. But we have enough left that we're able to pretty well reconstruct the entire circuit of the walls and some towers and just amazing features.
Yes.
And we found that where we do find remnants, it's just the foundation. That's about it. And we found that the wall was 4 meters wide. Well, that's about, 14, 15 feet when
that's
you
huge.
convert it to feet. Yes,
Yes.
one of the widest walls found in Israel. It's amazing. And so this was a heavily fortified site. It's small, like 2.5 acres, but heavily fortified because of the fact, I believe, it was this border outpost kind of defending Jerusalem from the north. And so kind of a rule of thumb is that the wall would probably be about 3 times as high as wide. So if you're talking 15 feet wide, you're talking about
Huge.
40, 50 feet high. It's
Excellent.
unbelievable.
Well, Dr. Wood, we have to end it right there. But friends, we're inviting you back to come back for part 2 of this episode. We are just getting started talking about how accurate the biblical account is when we compare it to our dig at Khirbet el-Makadr. We hope that you'll join us and you'll be encouraged by the research that we've done there. Thanks for joining us.
They're pulling that up. The reason that it sounds like they keep saying we're going to go to a break and they come right back, the reason that's happening is that the original episodes are actually airing on a TV channel in Pennsylvania. So that's actually the commercial breaks. And since they're putting it on YouTube, after that, they're cutting the commercial breaks out and just running it right back together. So that's why you're seeing that, just in case you're wondering.
Hi, my name is Henry Smith. Welcome to another exciting episode of Digging for Truth, where we look in the world of archaeology and compare it to the Bible and show how the biblical accounts are trustworthy and historical. In part 2 of our episode, we're going to be talking about the city of Ai from Joshua 7 and 8. And I'm here with Dr. Bryant Wood, professional archaeologist, friend, colleague, and mentor here in the studio. Bryant, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you here. We're very excited to have you here with us. We're now going to do part 2 about the city of Ai, looking for the lost city of Ai. Where we left off in our previous episode, we were talking about the location of Ai, the fortifications around Ai, the gate. We're going to pick up again where we were just talking about some of the fortifications around Ai. We're going to bring up a picture of Dr. Collins. We want to reconnect back to the previous episode. Just talk some more about these massive walls around the city of Ai.
Yes, here we are back to Khirbet el-Makadr, which we believe meets all the requirements to be the Ai of Joshua that we read about in chapters 7 and 8. The Bible indicates the place was fortified. Now, in our Bible, it says city of Ai. The Hebrew word there is Ir, and that simply means a fortified place. It could be a city, or it could be just a small fortress of some sort. And our fortress is relatively small, 2.5 acres. But we did find abundant evidence for fortifications. And here we're on the western side of the site, and here we uncovered a pretty well-preserved segment, and you can see our square supervisor standing on top of that. It's about 4 meters wide at the foundation. It tapers a little bit as it goes up. But here we see the wall itself from the time of Joshua, 1406 BC. There you can see it's right at the surface, and we hardly had to do any digging. And then behind him, you see another wall. Well, that's a modern wall. It has nothing to do with ancient Ai, except that it has prevented us from digging a portion of the fortress that's on the other side of that wall. We weren't allowed to dig over there, so we stopped right at that wall. And there was a lot of important things on the other side that we just couldn't get to.
Couldn't get to it. Well, they say when you go to Israel, expect the unexpected.
Oh, absolutely.
You went away one season, you came back, and that wall was built up.
There was that wall enclosing an agricultural area.
Yeah, and you couldn't do anything about it. Well, we're going to bring up on the screen a drawing of the fortress from the time right before Joshua and the time of Joshua. And you'll see in that red section, folks, on the screen there, it's about where Dr. Collins was standing on the wall.
Yes.
Just talk about how you've tried to trace out the fortifications in the work in the field.
Yes, we found bits and pieces, remnants remaining, because much of our fortress had been robbed out by later people that were there at the site and had their own constructions going on. So the green, yeah, that's the agricultural area. We did have one season in 1999 rather, between that wall was built between 1999 and 2000. But in 1999, we found a bit of a curved wall there that you can see in red inside the green. That's 3 meters wide.
So you think that might have been a tower?
Well, yeah, it has to be part of the fortification system.
Right, right.
So we just were able to dig just that little segment, but based on that, we were able to determine the diameter and kind of reconstruct what was there originally. The interesting thing about it was a little off-center. We could kind of draw an axis for the fortress through the gate. We had the one pier we uncovered, and this round tower, was just a little bit off-center. Now, for years I puzzled over that, and then it finally occurred to me, well, usually they were quite symmetrical in their construction. There must have been a gate next to it on the other side of the axis.
So double tower is what you thought it was.
With a kind of a back entryway between them.
And they would be able to look right to Jerusalem from those two towers.
Oh, absolutely.
Right,
yes.
so that would be a massive size tower and fortification
Yeah.
structure. So again, this is consistent, as we talked about in our last episode and now, consistent with the biblical account about the way, this is Canaanite, by the way, we didn't talk
Absolutely.
about that before. This was
Yes.
built before Israel came in the land. The Canaanites built massive structures all over Israel, which is what the Bible says.
Yes.
Right, and this is consistent with even our little fortress of 2.5 acres, quite well fortified.
Yeah, the spies said the walls were built up to heaven.
Yes.
And so, these towers are probably 50 feet high, maybe higher, who knows?
Amazing. The Canaanites loved to build things big and bigger, didn't they?
Wow, sure did.
Amazing stuff. Okay, so now we're gonna change direction a little bit. We made a remarkable discovery that we weren't expecting. Joshua 8:25 says that there were women at Ai. Now, when you were studying all this, you didn't really take that into account, like, oh, this is one of the criteria for finding Ai, is that there's women there. Yeah. But tell us what we found there that verified this small detail found in the text.
Yes.
We talk about that.
Well, being a border fortress, kind of in an out-of-the-way place, you would not really expect women to be there. At least I wouldn't think so, but yet the Bible lists women as being killed along with men. So there were women there. In 2009, when we restarted our excavations, I was digging in a square just to the south of the gate, and there were some walls there and some structures of some sort just inside the gate. And in the corner of one of those rooms of these buildings, I came upon a storage jar.
We're going to bring that up on the screen so folks can see
and,
that.
Yep. There it is. And just around that storage jar were vessels. Well, this is indicative of what we call an infant jar burial, where they would bury the infant inside the jar, and around it they would place offerings or whatever, but it's always part of these burials. We find different jugs and so on. And so that's what we discovered here. And so we actually found the bones of what's called a neonate died just before the time of birth or just after birth, and was buried. And they buried them under the floors of their houses, these young infants.
And those have been found in other places?
Oh, yes, other places.
Right, so you're able to compare them when you did your research.
Right, usually in a domestic situation, not in a fortress like this.
Yes.
So this indicates that there had to be women there. I mean, this was a child born or a stillborn or something. And there we see those bones. We didn't find the skull, but we found enough to be able to, the anthropologist who studied them was able to provide an age, around the time of birth. And so, yes, there were women there, as the Bible says, surprising as that is.
It's extraordinary. Here we found something we never even considered before, but this minute detail in the biblical text speaks of eyewitness testimony, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And not, a lot of scholars will say the accounts were written hundreds of years later.
Well, why would you say women? I mean,
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
Right.
Unless you saw women.
That there were women there at the fortress.
Yeah.
And here we find in the ground this. It was sad though, wasn't it? Because this little baby, whoever these parents were, had lost this precious child.
Yeah.
And I suppose in their religion they buried him in the floor of the home to keep them close in some kind of way. It must have been part of their grieving process. We're going to move into part 2 in just a few moments. We'll be talking more about the discoveries that we found at Khirbet el-Maqader, the site of Ai, which Dr. Wood was the lead investigator and lead archaeologist for quite a few years. We'll be right back after a few moments. Welcome back to Digging for Truth. We're in the studio today with Dr. Bryant Wood, professional archaeologist and ABR Director of Research. We're talking about the lost city of Ai and our excavations that we've done in Israel related to that, where we believe we've discovered the actual site of Ai. Bryant, we have some props here in the studio today that we're going to talk about. Folks, I'm sure have noticed them. We're going to begin, as we transition to that, by talking about what the book of Joshua says about the Israelites setting the city of Ai on fire. Is there evidence for that at our site? Because this would be a key piece of evidence that we need to find.
Yes. There's 3 cities, actually, in the conquest account where we read that the Israelites set it on fire. Well, this, as tragic as it would be for the people inside these places, that's a terrific thing for an archaeologist, because you can go and actually maybe find that layer of ash from that destruction that would correlate then with the biblical account. Well, unfortunately, our site has been exposed over the centuries, and so that ash, for the most part, would get washed away. And of course, there was rebuilding and a lot of later activity, agricultural activity, and so on. But we did find evidence for the destruction of the site, and we did, in fact, find some small amount of ash. For example, near the gate, we have these large, what we call monolithic or megalithic stones. And underneath the stone, there's a layer of ash. The stone was kind of protecting it.
Yes.
The stone fell at some point after the destruction and preserved
the ash layer.
Yes.
This is the kind of thing we look for as archaeologists.
Yes.
We're going to bring this up on the screen here from we call it square. We have our site is laid out in squares. In 2000, there was an ash layer discovered there in G24, which is this particular square. So not a lot of evidence, but enough to show that there was some kind of fire or conflagration that occurred at the site. So this is important. So it's a little piece of evidence, not a slam dunk. No. But now another piece of evidence that's really fascinating is what we call refired pottery. Now, if people watching this go, okay, let's talk about pottery and the fact that it's refired. Give them a little background on how they made pottery in the ancient world, a quick primer, if you will, on that.
Yes, well, that's the main thing we find when we dig is broken sherds, we call them, of pottery. And of course, the ancients used pottery for everything, for cooking and for eating, for storage, lamps, all kinds of things, because, clay is readily available. And so you mold it into the shape you want, you stick it in a kiln and fire it, and it gets rock hard. In fact, almost indestructible. Now, the vessel can be broken, but the pieces, they're going to survive.
They survive, right.
They're still in the ground today. So there's just pottery everywhere where there's an ancient site. And so for the archaeologist, that's a godsend because we can use pottery for dating. And in the case of this refired pottery, it also tells another story. Now, our pottery is fired to a certain temperature, something like 800 degrees centigrade when it's first made. But there are occasions where in some time periods they would fire it harder or to a higher temperature and make it very, very hard. But the Bronze Age, the time period we're talking about, time of Joshua, it would not be rock, concrete hard. But we found that a lot of the pottery we were digging up was very, very hard. And at first we thought, oh, this is Byzantine pottery when they fired the pottery very hard. But then when we looked at the shapes, they're early shapes. They're from,
much earlier. Byzantine is the church era, early church era, but you're talking about the time of Joshua.
Yeah.
So as you were trying to figure out
what's
why
going
is it
on
like
here?
this. Yeah.
Finally, it dawned on me that this pottery has been in a fire which has made it harder. It's been exposed to higher temperatures than was in the initial manufacturing of the pottery.
So it was made in the kiln, and then it was exposed again to very high temperatures, making it hard as concrete.
Yeah.
And so the forms that, now this is your area of expertise. I consider you an expert in a lot of things, but this is what you studied your PhD dissertation for, was on pottery from the time of Joshua,
Canaanite pottery.
Canaanite pottery. So you were easily able to identify, based on your knowledge, that these pottery types were from that period and that they had been refired. And folks, that's what we have here in the studio. The pottery that we're showing here is actually refired pottery that's been ignited in a second fire, and these types are from the time of Joshua. So this shows that the fortress was occupied when the Bible says that it was, which of course is what we're looking for. We're looking for evidence of that.
And the interesting thing is we found this kind of pottery all over the site, everywhere that we dug. Not all the pottery was refired, but that pottery which was on the surface at the time the Israelites set the fortress on fire were exposed to high temperatures. And were very, very hard. So that is a key evidence for what we read in the Bible, that they burned the fortress with fire.
Now, along those lines, you have a scripture verse from Joshua, because it indicates that you would like to share with the audience.
In Joshua 8:28, we read another thing that is kind of a requirement for our sight of eye, where it tells us that after they had set the place on fire, Joshua burned the place with fire and made it a permanent heap. The Hebrew is tel olam. Tel meaning kind of an ancient place, and olam, forever. A ruin forever. So we should expect Ai to be a ruin. Well, any ancient place mentioned in the Bible is pretty much a ruin. And it goes on to say, a desolate place to this day. So this raises an issue because I've mentioned the fact that we had later occupation. We have occupation in the Iron Age.
And during the time of Jesus.
During the time of Judges we had occupation. Time of Jesus, a church there in the Byzantine period. Well, that doesn't sound like, it's a ruin forever. So we need to parse this a little bit. So what it's talking about here is the fortress itself
is a ruin forever.
Be a ruin forever, and that's what it is. It's the remains are in the ground. It's never going to be rebuilt. It's a ruin forever. But then there's a little addition here: a permanent heap of ruin, and a desolate place to this day. Now that's another word. A desolation. At the time Joshua was written, a desolation. So that means the site was uninhabited, and it was a desolate place, and there was no agriculture, nothing going on. So we don't know exactly when the book of Joshua was written, but it was desolate at that time.
Right.
It would have had to been written before this Iron Age occupation that we have from the time of Judges.
From later period.
Because then, again, it's rebuilt, people are living there, agriculture's going on, and so that's very interesting that it was a permanent ruin as far as the fortress, Tel Olam, and then it was a desolation after the burning and destruction up until the time it was re-inhabited.
Another excellent affirmation of the biblical account. Folks, we'll be right back for segment 3. Don't go away. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. In segment 3, we're going to be talking more about the archaeological discoveries from the city of Ai at Khirbet el-Makadar and our excavations with Dr. Bryant Wood. Bryant, we were talking about evidence for fire and the destruction of Ai in our last segment. One of the pieces of evidence that we found for a battle taking place there are sling stones. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is a sling stone, and what did we find at Khirbet el-Makadar related to that?
Well, when we hear sling stone, we think of a slingshot. Well, that's something in our day and age, but in antiquity, they had these slings that you swung around and released, and they still use them today. You see the Arab boys shooting the rocks at the Israeli army or whatever.
Yes, right.
And they were deadly. They were deadly. Here's a sling stone about the size of a tennis ball, made of flint.
Yes.
And can you imagine this thing coming through the air and hitting you in the head?
Yes.
I mean, it would do a number.
Even at 20 or 30 miles an hour would kill you instantly.
And that's the kind of thing David was using against Goliath.
Against Goliath.
Goliath didn't have a chance.
That's right. It didn't matter how big or tall he was.
No.
Right.
No.
And David had become an expert of getting rid of wolves and such, protecting his sheep in the field.
Yeah.
All right. So now let's talk a little bit more. Sling stones are awesome, but we got to talk more about some pottery that we've discovered, some cool pottery from the time of Joshua. Now, I mentioned in the last segment, you're an expert in this kind of pottery, so you know your stuff. So we're going to show a storage jar here and a couple of drawings and so forth. Just talk briefly about the pottery that we've found at Khirbet el-Makadar.
Yeah, the pottery is a little different at our site because of the fact it was a fortress. Now, normally, you dig an urban site, there's a lot of domestic pottery and dishes and, cups and saucers and cooking pots and that sort of thing. Right. But here, since we're in this kind of isolated area, it had to be provisioned for the troops that were stationed there. We don't know how many, but there were obviously military personnel there.
Yes.
And so they had to eat and drink and so on. And so we have a lot of storage vessels, large storage jars, even very big jars we call pithoi. And these were for storing, the food, the oil, and whatever they would need in the way of supply.
Right.
So we have lots of storage jars. And the one we showed there on the screen is typical of the time period of the fortress, which is the end of the Middle Bronze period, beginning of the Late Bronze period.
So when you study these, you're not just making these dates up, like people could accuse you of that, I suppose. You've got to show from your own expertise, but also that these forms were found at other sites that other scholars have studied. Comment on that, because that's really important.
Well, yes, we do what we call a comparative analysis. In our site, unfortunately, we don't have layering, stratigraphy, which helps, dating and so on. It's kind of a mixed jumble from all the activity, agriculture, and so on. And so you've got late pottery mixed in with early pottery and so on. And so somebody can make the argument, this is late or it's early or something. So what we do, we take our pottery and we compare it with well-dated pottery from other sites. And so that way we have a firm context at some other place for a particular vessel. And when we find that same shape at our site, we can say ours dates to the same time period. Fortunately, pottery changes through time.
Right.
And so we're able to pin down the dates.
You can identify it. A string of 3 chords, I'm reminded of the proverb, we do your research and document it carefully so that you can show with certainty that the site was occupied. Now,
Right.
speaking of showing that the site was occupied during this time, we're going to share our best discovery, our funnest, most awesome discovery. If I could talk like I'm a teenager. Most awesome discovery, right? Is our Egyptian scarab.
Yes.
Let's share with the audience about that and a little bit about its discovery and the period that it's from.
Well, this was found in 2013, and it's very unusual in that it was found in the course of the excavation, what we call in situ, in its original position.
In a sealed context.
Yes,
That's what it means, right?
it's very small, half an inch or so in length there. We're looking at the bottom of it. Actually, scarab means beetle in French, and the upper side is rounded, but on the flat lower side, they would make an inscription or some kind of a motif, as we see on our scarab.
Okay.
So it's
Excellent.
very rare to find it in context, as we did. And so we were very fortunate in that regard. It didn't, wasn't from a burial or some other,
Or laying on the ground somewhere.
Yeah,
It was in
yeah,
a sealed context.
In its original context. There's our drawing. We can see how it's shaped. And the motif is very unique. It's a falcon-headed sphinx. Everybody's familiar with the Giza Sphinx, which
Right.
has the head of a pharaoh. But they considered the lion, the body, sacred, one of their, the animals that they worshipped. And they would combine the lion body with other, animals, and the
Right.
falcon was another deity. And so ours is a lion-headed sphinx, and we can date that very well to the reign of Amenhotep II by comparing it with scarabs that have the name of a pharaoh engraved right on it, so
Right.
the time period. Ours, unfortunately, doesn't have the name of the pharaoh.
We're going to bring that up on the screen. We'll show the parallel with Amenhotep. Now, we have about 30 seconds just to talk a little bit about this.
These are from the time of Amenhotep II, and we see the similarities in the motif. And Amenhotep II ruled just before the time of the conquest.
And we think he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Yes.
We'll
Pharaoh
throw
of
that
the
out to the audience, and we'll
Yes.
say, go to the ABR website to read more about
Yes.
that. Brian, I want to thank you so much for your entire life of dedication to doing archaeology, serving the body of Christ, and showing, just in this one example and much other work that you've done, your faithfulness to the Scriptures and your academic work that you've done to serve the church. We are all so grateful for it. It's a privilege to serve with you, and it's a privilege to be here with you today.
Well, Henry, it's been exciting and fun, and I've enjoyed every minute of this work that God has called me to do.
Amen. Folks, we just ask for your prayers for Dr. Wood as he continues to publish his research on Khirbet el-Makadr. We hope that this two-part episode has been very exciting for you. We hope you'll join us again as we continue to examine the world of archaeology and the Bible. Thanks for joining us.
All right, so you can see from all of the things that they talked about that it's not one little piece of evidence. They found stuff all over the site that helps them to date this to the exact time period. And going back to their first video, he was talking about Albright, saying it pretty much had to be at Tel. Again, when you look at a map, Et Tel and Khirbet el-Makadr are 5/8 of a mile apart. So, and Albright picked the spot, saying it fits pretty close. Well, he didn't do any of the archaeological work. People after that went there because of what he said, and then they're the ones who said, "Well, the Bible can't be right." All Albright did was locate the general area, and from that, like I said, they're 5/8 of a mile apart. I mean, and the other thing about the sling stones, I was reading an interesting thing maybe earlier this week on the sling stones, that archers could shoot 1 to 200 feet with a bow and arrow during the biblical time period. Sling stone, people who were trained in using those sling stones could sling a stone accurately for up to 1/4 of a mile. I mean that's the cannons of the day. just to put it bluntly, they could sling a stone almost 1/4 of a mile and hit if not hit the target, at least hit in the general area. So you take a whole bunch of slingers of the sling stone, people with sling stones, and you could blanket an area and absolutely just destroy everything that was coming at you. So that's just another one of those things. We talked about David, killing a wolf and a bear and all of those kind of things. I mean, they were trained to be able to hit, to put edges on a quarter with those things. So it's just another little piece of information that you find there. All right. Well, let's get into our prayer time. First off, I always want to make sure that we start with praises.